The $10 trillion lie. How the USSR was bankrupt 10 years before it fell. The memo landed on the Kremlin desk at dawn. Oil revenues collapsing, factories hitting quotas with goods nobody wanted, gold reserves thinning. "We can't pay our bills by spring," the line read. Outside, red banners still hung. Inside, the accountants knew the secret. This superpower was out of cash, but the public story? Growth, strength, progress. The real story began years earlier, in ledgers no one was supposed to read. To see how a giant died with a smile on its face, we need to go back to the charts that bent, the metrics that hid decay, and the people told to call crisis success. The mirage of growth, when numbers lied. Start with the headline that never made it to Pravda. The Soviet economy grew fastest when it measured itself by a yardstick designed to flatter. For decades, central planners reported net material product, NMP, counting what heavy industry produced and ignoring much of services. Tanks, turbines, and tons of steel dominated the scoreboard. The result looked like victory. Mid-century growth rates above 5%, second only to Japan, and charts shooting up through the 1960s. Inside ministries, managers learned the lesson early: meet the plan, maximize tonnage, and you'll be promoted. Whether anyone wanted the output was a different question. Here's the catch. By the early 1970s, the engine behind that growth had already begun to stall. Economists tracking total factor productivity, the efficiency with which capital and labor produced output, saw a slide. The miracle of moving millions from farms to factories had run its course. The easy gains of copying Western machinery slowed. What remained was a system that could still pile up numbers but struggled to create value. Meanwhile, the state's own numbers developed a habit. They hid what mattered. Managers faced quotas measured in gross indicators, tons, kilometers of pipeline, kilowatt hours, so they gamed the system. A pipeline built wider than needed met the plan. Heavier but obsolete machine tools met the plan. Warehouses filled with unsold spare parts met the plan. A factory director could ship unrequested inputs to another plant on December 31st and count it as fulfillment. The receiving plant, lacking storage, sent them back in January and booked its own plan as received. On paper, both succeeded. In the stores, consumers stared at empty shelves. The mirage deepened because prices weren't prices. In a command economy, planners set them. A ton of steel could be priced generously. A refrigerator barely covered its cost. The state then celebrated output that under world prices would have been a loss. When outside analysts tried to translate Soviet NMP into GDP, the gap widened. Declassified assessments painted a sobering picture. Higher military production masked stagnant consumer sectors. Services that made modern economies dynamic simply didn't register. The Soviet yardstick graded the wrong exam, and yet the triumphal story marched on. The system rewarded reports, not results. Every link of the chain had an incentive to embellish. Regional committees, ministries, enterprises. An honest shortfall meant punishment. A creative adjustment meant survival. Quality slipped because quality didn't count. Bearings failed early, tractors broke down, new equipment arrived as refurbished relics. The 1960s push to modernize by upgrading old capital often just consumed resources with negligible gains. Money was spent, the plan was fulfilled, productivity barely budged. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union hit another wall. Resource costs climbed. The iron mines dug deeper, the oil fields crept into harsher terrain, the coal seams got thinner. Extraction needed more steel, more energy, more transport, inputs that the plan labeled as heroic output. In truth, the economy was burning more fuel to stand still. The Ricardian trap had arrived, but the statistical system obscured it by counting costs as achievements. A second strand of the mirage ran through the consumer's daily life. Official consumption statistics claimed high calorie intake, comparable to the West, but calorie charts didn't capture cues, substitution, and quality. A family might secure calories as bread and potatoes while meat, fruit, and fresh dairy were scarce. The line outside a store was a shadow ledger, measuring shortages the plan never recorded. When black markets blossomed, they revealed prices that planners refused to see, the true exchange value of goods. But those prices were illegal facts, and illegal facts didn't enter the plan. Inside the defense complex, numbers had their own disguise. The share of national output devoted to the military was buried in euphemisms and off-budget accounting. Best estimates put the load at an extraordinary share of the economy, crowding out investment in new civilian capital, in infrastructure, in human capital. The military-industrial complex delivered technical feats, but outside those closed cities, the civilian machine aged. A state could maintain the silhouette of superpower by counting missiles. It couldn't maintain living standards by counting missiles. Glasnost later let a few voices admit what had been whispered. The growth slowdown had begun years before the headlines changed. Total factor productivity was negative in key sectors. New investment went to replace worn-out equipment, not to expand capacity or raise efficiency. The plan kept getting fulfilled. The economy kept losing steam. One micro-story captures it. A factory manager paid to hit output stocks a warehouse with valves that don't fit the pipelines actually being built. He knows they won't be used. He also knows the plan was met. The ministry signs off. The report shows progress. The pipeline team downriver improvises a workaround with older parts. Both managers protect themselves. The statistician notes rising industrial output. The nation gets a brittle system, impressive on paper, fragile in practice. By the early 1980s, the distance between the ledger and the street had become a chasm. The state's miracle metrics kept pointing up, but the signals that matter in any economy, price, profit, loss, demand, were muffled or missing, replaced by planned targets that told people how to act and told leaders what they wanted to hear. The Mirage wasn't just fuzzing the view, it was steering decisions. Investments flowed to where indicators were easiest to fulfill, not where value was created. In that sense, the numbers didn't just lie about the future, they helped kill it. Oil lifeline. The 1973-1986 Windfall. To understand how the ledgers stayed sunny while the engine coughed, follow the pipeline. In 1973, the world oil price jumped. For Moscow, it was oxygen. Hard currency poured in from Western Europe's refineries and the Comecon clients who paid in rubles but freed up Soviet barrels for sale abroad. The miracle metrics suddenly had a cash register attached. Dollars meant imports, and imports covered sins. When domestic machinery broke, Western equipment bridged the gap. When grain harvests failed, American wheat arrived. The balance sheets looked healthier not because factories became efficient, but because global prices turned favorable. Inside the ministries, oil receipts became policy. The planners didn't change their yardsticks, they changed how they paid the bill. Instead of fixing incentives, they wrote checks. The 1970s revenue surge bought time, and with it illusions. Credit lines opened in European banks. Bank quietly expanded hard currency borrowing to finance equipment, grain, and technology. The defense complex hummed undisturbed, shielded by the petrodollar cushion. On paper, investment remained high. In practice, much of it replaced worn-out capital, while the newest capital came off foreign docks. Meanwhile, the countryside told a harder story. Collectivized agriculture still underperformed. After the early shock of collectivization, harvests rose with more tractors and fertilizers, but under the surface, the incentive problem lingered. Private plots, tiny in acreage, continued to deliver outsized shares of meat and vegetables. The state farms absorbed inputs and produced output measured in gross tonnage. Yet by the 1970s, the grain trap was obvious to anyone reading the import invoices. The USSR became one of the world's largest grain buyers, paying in dollars it earned from oil. The famous 1972 grain deal with the United States, what traders later dubbed the Great Grain Robbery, was an early sign. Through the decade, these purchases weren't a one-off rescue, they were a yearly patch. The windfall also masked the creeping cost of extraction. Western Siberia's oil fields were prolific, but they weren't cheap forever. As fields matured, the Soviet Union pushed farther into harsh terrain. New pipelines snaked across permafrost. Steel, compressors, and pumps, many sourced from abroad, were consumed at rising rates. In the statistical yearbooks, all that counted as output. In the balance of payments, it showed up as imports funded by previous oil cargoes. The plan celebrated tonnage. The accountants watched margins thin. Abroad, détente gave Moscow more buyers. Western Europe wanted gas and crude. The Soviets wanted turbines and chemical plants. Deals were struck, long-term gas contracts in exchange for pipelines and compressors. It looked like reciprocity, and in some ways it was. But the deeper trade was this. The Soviet system swapped present resource rents for temporary relief from its structural inefficiencies. Instead of reforming price signals or enterprise autonomy, it traded barrels for time. Inside the Politburo, the numbers seemed to say the model worked. Growth rates slowed but didn't collapse. Shelves still suffered shortages, but showcase stores in Moscow improved modestly. Consumer durables, televisions, refrigerators trickled in. Meanwhile, military procurement stayed sacrosanct. Estimates from Western analysts put defense outlays at a very high share of national output, often cited in the mid-teens to mid-20s%, deep enough to crowd out civilian modernization if the windfall ever ended. As long as oil held, the bill could be paid with fewer visible sacrifices. There was a second effect, subtler and more dangerous. The windfall entrenched habits. Enterprise directors learned that spare parts could be obtained with hard currency imports rather than better domestic coordination. Ministries learned that shortfalls could be erased with purchases abroad rather than by changing incentives at home. The black market revealed true scarcities, but the official answer came from foreign catalogs, not domestic reform. Hard currency became the lubricant for a planned machine that otherwise seized. Then, from 1981 to 1985, the warning lights. Global oil markets softened as non-OPEC production rose and demand growth cooled. The floor still held, but cracks showed. And in 1986, the floor gave way. A supply surge and price war drove the Brent benchmark down sharply. For the Soviet budget, this was a guillotine. Suddenly, the external subsidy vanished. Hard currency earnings plunged just as import dependency had solidified. The central bank could sell gold. Reserves had long been a quiet buffer, but bullion sales can't repair incentives. Bank could borrow, but creditors read the same price charts. What the Kremlin memos now revealed, what the public didn't see, was a cash flow shock layered on structural decay. Defense could not be touched easily. Agriculture still needed foreign grain. Industry still needed Western inputs to keep decrepit lines running. The hard choices appeared: cut civilian imports, raid reserves, or admit the plan's numbers had never reflected value. Leadership tried to do all three without saying so. Consumer imports shrank, queues lengthened, spare parts disappeared, gold shipments increased. Here's where the Mirage met the market. In the plan, a ton of steel equaled a ton of steel. In the world market, a barrel priced at $12 couldn't pay for the same list of imports a $30 barrel did. The mechanism that had let Moscow paper over inefficiency evaporated. The bills came due, not in ideology, but in invoices. And the accounts showed something brutal. Without high oil prices, the system's internal cash generation was too weak to sustain its promises. The oil lifeline didn't cause the disease, it hid it. For 13 years, windfall rents gave the Soviet model a pass on reform, and they trained its managers to expect a bailout from geology. When the price fell, the subsidies the system paid to itself, cheap energy, overstaffed factories, mispriced inputs, no longer had an external sponsor. The accountant's secret became the country's fate. 1986 oil crash. Math turns against Moscow. The graph broke like a bone. In early 1986, Brent slid into the teens, then brushed $10.12 a barrel. For a system that had turned oil into oxygen, this wasn't a bad quarter, it was asphyxiation. Hard currency earnings, long propped up by petroleum, fell by billions almost overnight. The accountants who'd used oil receipts to cover the gap between plan and reality now faced arithmetic that refused to be negotiated. Every shipment out bought fewer lifelines back in. Inside Bank, ledgers that had absorbed years of purchases, grain, machine tools, chemical plants, lost their cushion. Existing commitments didn't pause because prices fell. Western suppliers still expected payment, interest still ticked. The Soviet Union could and did sell more volume, but the global glut meant volumes didn't rescue revenues. On the budget side, ministries that had quietly relied on oil windfalls to fund deficits were told to tighten. Cutting military procurement was politically close to impossible. Cutting civilian imports was immediate and visible. What nobody outside those rooms saw in the headlines was the triage list. Grain first, because bread rations were non-negotiable. Machinery second, because whole industrial chains depended on a steady drip of Western parts keeping worn Soviet equipment alive. Consumer durables last, because televisions could wait in theory. By the summer of 1986, wait became vanish. Queues lengthened. Black market prices rose, revealing scarcity that official price tags refused to acknowledge. It wasn't ideology that changed, it was invoices. The country felt the absence. The leadership turned to gold. For years, bullion had been a silent buffer, converted to dollars when seasonal needs spiked. Now sales accelerated. The state bank discreetly sold into London and Zurich to bridge gaps in the balance of payments. Gold bought time, but at a cost. The reserve that signaled strength became a pawn in weekly cash flow. The signal to creditors was unmistakable. Lines of credit tightened, tenors shortened, and the premium for Soviet risk crept up. Meanwhile, the energy sector itself was an expensive patient. Western Siberian fields needed capital to sustain output as pressures fell and wells aged. New drilling into harsher zones required compressors, turbines, and control systems, a shopping list that since the 1970s had leaned on Western suppliers. After the Toshiba-Kongsberg scandal, access to cutting-edge gear was constrained. After the price collapse, the money to buy even permitted technology thinned. The Ministry of Oil Industry was told to maintain output with less. Managers cannibalized equipment, ran pumps longer, deferred maintenance. It kept barrels moving, but reliability slipped. The export mix tilted toward volume over value. Inside Gosplan, a different reckoning began. The plan had always conflated inputs with success: more steel, more energy, more tonnage. But 1986 exposed a truth the statistics hid. If a ton of exported crude earned half the dollars, the same input regime generated fewer tradable resources to fund the rest of the economy. The internal accounting, denominated in rubles and targets, couldn't square that circle. The external account, denominated in dollars, demanded an answer. The planners tried to reallocate, but the command system was slow. Enterprises kept producing to old quotas because deviation meant punishment. Warehouses filled with the wrong goods while stores ran out of the right one. At the same time, the arms race meter kept running. Western estimates pegged defense at an enormous share of national output, deep enough that under oil stress it crowded everything else. Afghanistan still consumed resources and lives. The defense-industrial complex, insulated by secrecy and prestige, had priority on materials and skilled labor. Civilian industries, already aging, lost further ground. Perestroika was being discussed, but talk didn't free up bearings, microchips, or lubricants. There were human markers for the macro shift. A port dispatcher in Odessa watched refrigerated containers arrive late and leave half empty as foreign suppliers cut shipments and buyers tightened terms. A factory in Tolyatti received word that imported components would be rationed. Managers rewrote production plans twice in a month and sent workers home on idle days. A Leningrad mother, used to supplementing the state store with farmers' markets, found prices there jumping as shortages rippled outward. Each was an entry in a ledger. The plan didn't keep. The government tried multiple patches. Price reforms were floated to address hidden inflation. Partial enterprise autonomy was expanded in the hope that local initiative would raise efficiency. But 1986 wasn't a laboratory year. It was a liquidity crisis layered on structural rot. Giving a director more leeway didn't conjure bearings that didn't exist or foreign exchange that wasn't earned. When prices were nudged, money chased scarcity, queues shortened only to be replaced by empty shelves. The state's credibility took a hit because promises now collided with daily experience. Foreign policy narrowed to economics. Gas for Pipelines deals with Europe held long-term take-or-pay contracts begun in the 1970s, 1980s, providing a steadier stream than oil, but those contracts couldn't fill the hole alone. The ruble remained non-convertible. Internal prices and wages floated in a universe separate from the world market. Closing that gap would require either devaluation and shock or prolonged austerity and reform. Politically, neither route was prepared. Administratively, the machine wasn't built for abrupt course changes. The accountants' memos turned blunt. Without higher prices or deep cuts, external payments would strain to breaking. Defense was protected. Social spending had political constituencies. Subsidies to loss-making enterprises were embedded. That left the thin layer of imports that greased the whole system. Cut them and breakdowns multiplied. Keep them and reserves bled. 1986 forced the choice into the open, even if no one admitted it on television. This was the hinge. For 13 years, oil's generosity had covered mispricing, misallocation, and missed reforms. In 1986, the math reversed the subsidy. After that, every month the country lived a little more on memories and a little less on margins. And once a system starts selling its future to fund its present, the end is already scheduled. Energy hunger. Oil and coal efficiency slide. While the price collapse shredded the balance of payments, something deeper was already eating the core. It took more energy every year to get energy. The country that bragged about output in tons and barrels was quietly losing the return on each ton and barrel it produced. To see it follow a mine shaft down. In the 1960s, iron ore and coal came from shallower seams in European Russia and Ukraine. Haul distances were short, equipment simpler, winters milder. By the 1970s and early 1980s, pits in Kursk and Kryvyi Rog had deepened, overburden climbed, conveyor runs lengthened. Every meter down meant more explosives, more electricity for hoists, more spare parts for crusher. The plan called those inputs achievements. Megawatts consumed, ton-kilometers moved. The engineer on the night shift called them what they were, rising costs to stand still. Coal told the same story. The Donbass seams that had fueled Soviet steel since the 193s were exhausted in their easiest sections. Output shifted to deeper, gassier faces and to remote basins in Kuzbass. Each new ton demanded more roof supports, more ventilation, more diesel for underground haulage, and more safety downtime after methane spikes. Meanwhile, aging equipment lingered because managers couldn't stop lines long enough to replace them without missing quota. The 1960s, modernization drive had refurbished fleets without redesigning flows. By the 1980s, breakdowns multiplied and cannibalization became policy. On paper, coal output targets held. In practice, each unit of coal delivered required more steel, more labor, and more kilowatt-hours than a decade before. Oil's story was bigger and harsher. Western Siberia, Samatler above all, changed the nation's fortunes in the late 1960s and 1970s. Those were flush fields, high pressure, generous flow, but reservoirs age. Water cut rises, pressures fall, wells need artificial lift, and secondary recovery becomes standard. By the early 1980s, Samatler was showing classic decline symptom. To stabilize production, ministries ordered intensive drilling campaigns and stepped up water injection. That meant more rigs, more casing, more pumps, more chemicals, and more power to push water in and lift fluids out. It looked heroic in the annual report. Hundreds of new wells drilled, kilometers of new gathering lines laid, thousands of tons of equipment installed. In economic terms, the energy return on energy invested was sliding. There was a geographic tax, too. The frontier moved north and east into permafrost, taiga, and swamps. Foundations had to be insulated. Pipelines needed heating stations. Winter access required ice roads and specialized vehicles. Every meter of pipe across the Ob or the tundra ate steel and electricity. Compressors that kept gas moving across thousands of kilometers into Europe had to fight physics and temperature, and they drew heavily from a power grid already strained. The plan counted the electricity those compressors consumed as production. The accountant who tried to price it at world cost would have called it what it was, a margin killer. What nobody admitted in speeches was that the energy sector's gross growth masked a net squeeze. If the oil ministry pumped 2 million more tons but burned an extra 100 million kilowatt-hours, thousands more tons of steel, and imported critical compressors to do it, the net contribution to the rest of the economy could stagnate or fall. The Soviet metrics didn't track net energy or net value, they tracked heroic effort. That's how ministries learned to survive, by demonstrating effort. Meanwhile, coal's rising cost hit railways, another hidden sink. Longer hauls from Kuzbass to Ural steelworks and from remote pits to power plants soaked up locomotives and wagons. Turnaround slowed as maintenance lagged, and the system compensated by keeping rolling stock moving longer at lower reliability. Rail power plants burned more coal to move coal. Again, the plan recorded movement as success. Managers tried to economize where they could, but the incentive structure pushed the other way. A director who requested fewer inputs risked missing output targets. A director who demanded more inputs to ensure plan fulfillment was prudent. When energy intensity rose, the rational bureaucratic move was to ask for more electricity quotas, more diesel allocations, more steel allotments. Across ministries, the safest response to inefficiency was scale. And scaling, an inefficient process, deepened the trap. This energy hunger bled into foreign accounts. To keep fields flowing and mines open, ministries ordered Western pumps, drill bits, turbines, and control systems, precisely the items that COCOM controls scrutinized and, after scandals, increasingly restricted. When oil prices were high, those imports were manageable. After 1986, they became a knife at the budget's throat. The country needed more foreign gear to extract each marginal barrel that now earned fewer dollars. That is what the accountants meant when they warned that math, not ideology, was closing in. There were micro-stories behind the macro. A shift supervisor at Samatler signed off on 5 workovers in a week after pump failures. The spare parts locker was empty, so crews stripped components from lower flow wells to keep high flow wells alive. In Kuzbas, an electrical engineer begged for new switchgear to prevent arc faults underground. His ministry allotted refurbished units that tripped irregularly, forcing costly stoppages. In Vorkuta, permafrost heave-warped a conveyor foundation. Maintenance improvised shims to make it through winter. Each decision preserved output for the month and dug the system deeper into energy inefficiency. By the mid-1980s, the net result was unavoidable in the numbers the public never saw. More of the nation's total capacity, steelmaking, machine building, electricity, was being consumed to feed the energy sector itself. The sectors that could have renewed civilian life, housing materials, transport upgrades, consumer durables, were crowded not only by defense, but by energy's own appetite. The economy had become a snake eating its tail, and every additional ton that proved plan fulfillment took another bite. The grain trap, buying bread with dollars to see how a superpower mortgaged dinner start in the fields. The Soviet Union could mobilize for steel and space, but bread still came from soil and incentives. Collectivized farms had land and machinery. They lacked ownership and feedback. Work teams met acreage and tonnage targets, not profit. Inputs, fertilizer, diesel, spare parts arrived late or wrong. When rain ruined a harvest, there was no price signal to reallocate. There was a decree and a new quota. Private garden plots, a sliver of the acreage, quietly produced outsized shares of meat, eggs, and vegetables because people kept what they grew. The system's scoreboard didn't reward that, so it kept scaling what didn't work. The bill landed in Chicago. In 1972, Soviet buyers quietly swept U.S. grain under long-term contracts at subsidized prices, the Great Grain Robbery. Washington only realized later that Moscow's crop shortfall was worse than advertised. The ships kept coming because they had to. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the USSR became one of the world's largest grain importers. It wasn't a one-off rescue, it was policy. Wheat, corn, and soybeans sailed from American Gulf ports and Canadian terminals into Black Sea harbors, paid for with hard currency earned from oil and gold. Inside the planning apparatus, this made perverse sense. Food was political. Bread queues could topple mayors and shake ministries. If oil dollars could turn into grain that stabilized cities, you spent them. But each cargo was a confession. The command system couldn't feed itself reliably, even with some of the richest farmland on Earth. Tractors rolled, combines cut, and still the state bought bread abroad. The mechanics were unforgiving. Collective farms absorbed massive inputs, mechanization, fertilizer, irrigation, yet yields lagged behind comparable Western operations. Managers hit gross output targets by harvesting early to avoid missing quotas, even if moisture penalties ruined the crop's quality. Storage losses were chronic, silos leaked, handling equipment broke. Transport bottlenecks meant grain sat in sidings for days, molding before it reached mills. None of this showed up where it mattered for promotion. The plan counted tons harvested. It didn't dock points for tons spoiled. Hard currency turned all that hidden waste into a visible cost. Oil at $30 made the grain habit tolerable. Oil in the teens turned it into a crisis. Each import tender forced a trade-off with machinery, chemicals, and consumer goods also competing for dollars. Vneshekonombank wired payments to U.S. exporters while ministries begged for credit lines to keep factory lines running. The food bill had seniority. That meant a lathe in Sverdlovsk might go without bearings, but bread would be baked in Moscow. There was a diplomatic tax, too. Grain tied Moscow to suppliers it publicly denounced. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Washington debated embargoes after Afghanistan. Even partial restrictions tightened Moscow's math. To hedge, the Soviets diversified toward Argentina, Canada, and Australia, but shipping distances rose, freight costs climbed, and quality varied. The supply chain extended just as the budget strained. Meanwhile, the domestic fix that might have eased the trap, paying farmers real prices, allowing market-oriented procurement or freeing distribution, ran into the system's ideology and muscle memory. Raising procurement prices improved output on the margins, but it also blew up budgets because subsidized bread prices at the store didn't move. The state ate the difference. Allowing more private trade officially risked admitting the black market had solved problems the plan couldn't. Politically, that was hard. Administratively, it was dangerous for careers built on control. On the ground, the contradictions were human. A combined driver in Stavropol hit his quota by cutting on a schedule that ignored moisture content. Millers downstream cursed the clogged screens and lower flour extraction. A city bakery manager, told to maintain rations, received flour with inconsistent quality and compensated by mixing in more imported grain. Loaves shrank slightly and customers noticed. A port stevedore in Novorossiysk watched American wheat arrive just as local shipments were rejected for contamination. Everyone did their job. The system still bought bread with dollars. Hidden inside the grain trade was a feedback loop that hardened bad habits. The more the state covered shortfalls with imports, the less pressure there was to reform land tenure, procurement, and logistics. Farm directors learned that pleading weather and equipment shortages could be patched from abroad. Ministries learned that a short letter to Vneshekonombank was easier than tackling middlemen skimming at every stage. Oil's windfall subsidized agricultural inefficiency just as it did industrial inefficiency. After 1986, that subsidy evaporated. Then the math turned personal. Urban families who had always relied on bread as the anchor of their diet watched queues lengthen and bakery hours tighten. Rumors about import delays spread faster than official announcements. Housewives formed informal networks to track deliveries. Black market bread appeared at painful prices, revealing again the real scarcity the plan refused to price. In the countryside, resentment simmered. Farmers saw imported grain displace their harvest in city ovens while their own inputs were rationed. The grain trap wasn't just that the USSR bought wheat abroad. It was that the purchases signaled a deeper truth. The command system couldn't match incentives to outcomes in the one sector where politics demanded success. When oil covered the bill, the country could pretend the flaw was temporary. After the crash, every shipload was a reminder that the old ledgers were lying. Bread had turned into a balance of payments item. And when a regime starts financing breakfast with bullion and borrowed dollars, the end of the story is already written in the bakery's flour dust.